Welcome to Brave with Lisa. This space is designed to inspire, champion, and equip you to bravely walk in that unique rhythm of grace and calling that God has designed just for you. I'm so excited you're joining us today.
Welcome to Brave with Lisa. I'm your host, Lisa Bruton, and today I am so excited and delighted to have Shawn Bolz with me. Now, Shawn actually wrote this book called Translating God, which is how I kind of came across who he was. And it so deeply impacted me, my relationship with God, my relationship with others, and also the trajectory of Arise Sanctuary. And he has this great podcast called Exploring the Marketplace, which is one of my favorites as well. So to say I'm excited is an understatement, but I know we're about to just hear such wisdom and some wonder from Shawn today. So welcome, Shawn.
I'm so glad to be here. And I was so glad when you were on our podcast. You were so awesome.
Oh, thank you. It was so much fun being on your podcast. And I know today we're going to have fun as well. Can you share a bit about just what your world looks like at the moment and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, for 27 years, I traveled the world and did a lot of itinerant speaking and helped church planters and helped movement planters, and then planted my own church in Los Angeles. And then when I first got married to my wife, Cherie, we went on a journey of just asking God. We both felt called to help influencers and help people who are, we live here in Los Angeles, to help people who are on their journey. And so I really felt called to entertainment industry all along, but it wasn't to be an entertainer necessarily in a traditional way. And so we transitioned our ministry, but during that, God captured me up in a season where people are the hungriest they've ever been to hear his voice and to understand what that looks like in a balanced biblical way that doesn't get weird. And so for the last, 7 or 8 years as well, I've always taught that theme, but I've been one of the main teachers in the whole body of Christ about that theme, and spun off of that into launching our podcast, which you were on, and then also a couple shows on TBN, which is an American network here. I think you guys get TBN over there. And then also a show called the Shawn Bolz Show, which is a social and journalistic commentary show. I never saw myself as a journalist, and now I am one, which is really strange. But I think when you're a voice in the church and you're speaking into culture, it makes sense. So it makes a lot of sense. So my day-to-day life now has changed greatly from even 3 years ago when I was, before the pandemic. I was a itinerant speaker traveling, 60 stops a year. And now I'm a social commentator and leading a conversation with God's doing in the marketplace, and then also helping people, on-ramp people into the fact that they can hear his voice. And we do it through an online spiritual growth academy. We also do it through TBN, which is the network I'm on.
How incredible. I love how God just shapes and takes us to places that we just wouldn't even think of. But it makes sense when you're there, right? Like you said.
Yeah.
Now, Shawn, one of my favorite things about you and reading your books is your stories. Can you share some of your stories? One of your favorites. Actually, I want to, but let's start with the first one.
It was so funny because today one of our partners, ministry partners, sent in a request for prayer because she has a teenager going through some really huge challenges. And we're talking about could be in trouble for the rest of his life challenges. And I just immediately had this response of I'm praying with you, for real. This is me, Shawn, not just a partner, director or whatever. I'm praying for you, and here's what I feel like God's going to do. And it reminded me of, I was in a homeless shelter. I've done stuff with the poor all around the world, love the poor, love being with people who are marginalized and disenfranchised and people who we forget about, IDP camps. I've been in war zones and the whole thing. But for years, I was like, what is our poor like in America for real? Because you see homeless people standing, and it doesn't feel real that in a country like here, there could be real poverty. It felt more addiction or mental illness or whatever. So I decided to volunteer at some shelters, and one of them was in Atlanta. It's called Blood and Fire, a Christian shelter. And I went there quite a bit. So I went a lot. And one of the times I was there, they asked, would you do what you do in a conference here and teach the people before they go to bed? You have an hour, And I was like, well, that's interesting. Because they were all supposedly had gotten saved. So they're like, let's ask God to come. So I sat there, and half the people there were on drugs. They was drugged out, messed up. But the other half were interested. And I called out this guy, and he was everyone's favorite guy, which I didn't know. And I said, you have a call of leadership on your life. The enemy's been trying to take you out, and your mom's been praying for you. And your mom, and he's now in his 30s. He's already in his 30s. I said, your mom's been praying for you, and she's been praying for you to return to the call that she saw when you left college and you started this pathway. But there's a new pathway that's going to start. And if you want to, you can come live with me and do your rehab. And there's a rehab down, and I lived in, funny enough, Alabama at the time for a year. You can do your rehab here, and as you do your rehab, I'll mentor you, and I'll help you. And he just started weeping because he had never had, his dad was like really disconnected from him. He never had like that father type figure. Even though I think I was around the same age as him, he never had that kind of experience. But what I loved about it is that after the whole thing happened, so he comes down and he spun out, of course, like, because it takes like 7 times a rehab before you even get, if you're gonna get clean, if you get clean. So this is like his 6th, and he did get clean, which is awesome, but he spun out first. But I remember I went up to Atlanta to be with him and his mom. He had moved back with his mom, who's at that point was clean. And she said, you have no idea. She said, I prayed and I said, God, when he went down to Atlanta and he was in this Blood and Fire Ministries and this rehab, I prayed and I said, let them see his full value, God. And she goes, I'm not going to give up on hope of this son who she couldn't even give birth to him. She had to have a C-section. She had this like radical, crazy story, and she dedicated him to God. And she said, and she's not even like our kind of church stream, but she loves Jesus. And she goes, and he told me he was going to move down with you, and I knew you were the answer to the prayers I prayed all along. And right before his father passed away, they had this radical reconciliation. And he's a businessman now. He's like, you would never be able to tell him from anybody else in the world. Like, he's just so solid in who he is. But I just think I like that story because, first of all, in my faith, I needed to see what I was doing in the church works everywhere. I needed to see, and then the second thing is I was like going, God, these people are someone's family. Like, whose family are they? And what are their families praying? And in that moment, I could see what his mom was praying. I came to agreement. Then I mean, it was sacrificial to actually move a drug addict into my home.
Yeah.
And at the time I wasn't married, and I had 3 guys in my house, and they were all interns or ministry guys, whatever. So, but to move him in, it cost us all. Like, I remember one day he had stolen my laptop for drugs, and we're looking for my laptop together because he didn't want to admit he stole it. And he's like, I don't know where it is. I'm like, you're literally looking for the laptop that you stole for drugs. I found out later, I was like, just that's kind of the stuff we dealt with all the time in that season. But I love the transformation. I just love the transformation. If we'll risk love, and if we'll risk for love, like that, I knew that wasn't the end of the story when he spun out on drugs again. And then I went and found him, and we brought him up to a court case, and that's when he decided once and for all, I'm done. And I mean, that's 14 years ago, 18 years ago. Sorry, 18 years ago. And he's lived a solid life ever since he's married and has 2 kids.
Oh, I love that story. And I can only imagine what he now carries because of what you have put into him as well.
Well, he tells people the story. He's like, this guy, Shawn Bolz, found me I was drug addicted in a homeless shelter. And if he really tells the story, he tells some deep details. And people look at him like, because he's white and he's like middle class now, and he's completely normal, like acclimated to, society again. And they're like, no, there's no way you were homeless in a homeless shelter on drugs. And someone came and found me, and yeah, God sent him there, and he found me, and he brought me to live with him, a minister. Why I was on drugs, it's like that kind of story,
How did that impact your heart, that whole journey?
Well, I think I was so, some people right now are deconstructing their faith in Christianity.
Yeah.
I wasn't deconstructing my faith at all. I was just saying, God, I just need to see that my faith works everywhere for real. Like that, you hear these messages in church, and I even preach messages in church, and I was going to some places, and I was solid that it works with the extreme poor and in war zones. But I felt like America was so marginalized from real power and real connection to God. And most Western countries, I was feeling that at that time in my 30s, I felt like I have to see if your presence will go, and if you can transform lives the same way we're seeing it in Africa, the same way we're seeing it in South America. And so I think for me, it was kind of the final frontier of like, if God could do this when I go to Los Angeles, because I hadn't moved to LA to go to minister in the entertainment industry. If God could do this with these drug addicts, I mean, I brought in a family member who was a drug addict, and they had no hope for it, and she got completely rehabbed in a year, and she had an encounter with God. And I was like, okay, God's doing it. He's doing my family. He's doing other people's families. He's setting the orphans and families, the lonely and families, and that's healing their issues. And so I was like, if God could do it here, he could do it anywhere. So I think it gave me a lot of faith for my greater calling. And I still stop, for the poor. Like, I just think of my daughters who are so compassionate. Like last week we were, outside of a fast food place real fast. One of my daughters had to go to the bathroom on the way home from school. And the other one said, can we give that man money? And I said, yeah, but tell him why. Tell him why you want to give him money. And I said, why do you want to give him money? She's 7. She said, I want to give money because I don't think God wants him on the streets. I don't think God wants to be homeless. I said, tell him that. And so she did. She goes, and she's shy. I don't even think I told Sheree this, and she's sitting over in the room. And she said, God doesn't want you to be homeless, and he wants you to, he doesn't, yeah, that's all she said. And I want to give this to you. And she handed him, I think, a couple dollars that I gave her. And he said, listen to your father, because your father's a good man. And I didn't have a father like him. And I know I'm not supposed to be here either. You're right. And she just smiled really big. He was really neat because he affirmed her, like in her giving it and her speaking that over him. He affirmed her. And we got in the car and I could tell, like, she's talked about 3 times since it's happened.
Yay.
So I could tell, like, it really did something, like, where she knew she was partnering with God.
Yes. That was a significant moment for her.
Yeah, 7 years old.
Incredible. Oh, I love.
And I was trying not to stop to go to the bathroom. I almost missed it.
Don't you love how
wait,
kids...
we're 15 minutes from home.
Love that. That is so cool. And it also brings hope to those who are praying for, you know, loved ones who just are in a tough spot, right?
Yeah, that God has someone that is the answer to their prayer, to go and meet with them. I just think I always pray now, God, surround my family members with Christians and people who are really going to move in faith towards them, because you never know. Like, I've been so blessed by, we don't have a very big family on my side. And so I've been so blessed by people who have what my family would have done if we had a healthy, functioning family. Besides, my immediate family is great, but beyond them, it wasn't very supportive. And so I found these family members through the body of Christ that have been that strength to us as well. And I think that's so beautiful when I can step into a lot of the prophetic, like giving words to people. And especially when there's actionable items to it, when you have to do something. I have to do a lot with my prophetic words. It's not just like God loves you and has a big destiny. It's actually like, I want you to invest in them, or I want you to help them. Or like, there's one group that, it was several years ago, they came to a meeting I was doing, and at the last night I was invited to the meeting, and they were invited to the meeting to just pray for the donors of this big festival thing. And so I prayed for this guy. He was a donor, but I prayed for him. He's from South Africa. I prayed for him, and I gave him a prophetic message that I think really became a blueprint for his business.
Wow.
But he didn't know it yet. And so over the next couple of years, it was about cryptocurrency stuff too, which is really, I didn't even know anything about it at the time. It was very outside the box word for both of us. And it was about creating a NASDAQ for human potential through cryptocurrency. And he's doing exactly that. So years later, he wanted to come in contact with me. So met a mutual friend, said, can you talk to Shawn? And, you know, I want to talk to him. So when we got back together, we started to, like, I had another word for him, which is really fun, which I wasn't expecting, but he started to tell me, you know, in that moment, out of all the people in the world that I was trying to get wisdom from, I was just trying to hear God. I was trying to know my future, what I needed to partner my faith to God. We were in a really hard place financially, emotionally. And you came along and you were a complete stranger, but I could feel that you cared about me as if I wasn't a stranger. And that's the best advice that any Christian could ever get, is that, not advice, compliment, because that's what we want, is we want people to feel like we're in the affection we have for family, whether they're homeless or this business guy who's very wealthy now, that we feel like home to them. And that's the part where I'm always growing towards, because I feel like sometimes we can get very performance based or very in the moment for the sake of, I mean, I've seen prophetic people or ministers or teachers, they've totally lost touch with being connected to what they're even doing.
Yeah.
But they could do it really well, but
Yes.
they can't do it for the people very well, because there's that lack of connection. And so for me, it's been like that place of, like, how do I stay connected? How do I stay, like, present? How do I stay focused? How do I stay, like, warm? And that's been a really, something I've been growing through for a long time.
Yeah. And I mean, I can see that in you, that you are warm and you're available and you do see the person in front of you. And I think you carry the Father's heart.
No, I appreciate that. Whoops. Sorry
That's
about
okay.
that.
Oh, that's all right.
Just came on.
Do you have another favorite story that you can share with us?
I would say so for editing's sake, I'm gonna make sure that this doesn't ring again. I thought I was on Do Not Disturb. Okay. I would say another favorite story that doesn't involve other people, but involves God's love for me, is I was in the middle of an experiential season where I was being given a lot of favor and opportunity, specifically in ministry at the time. I was also doing business in the video game industry, which I recognized was, the hand of God, because I could work part-time there, but I was managing a full-time team that I was also working in ministry. So I was doing both. And at one point I had, one of the largest, who I'm with now, TBN, they came after me and asked me to do a show. I had an incredible publisher come and pursue me. I'd never written a book, and asked me to write a book. And I was in my 20s, and I had unlimited ministry opportunities. I was speaking at that time. The smallest audiences was 1,500 people. It was typically 3,000 to 5,000 people everywhere we spoke in conferences. And I was so young and I was so inexperienced. And I remember at one point, this man I was at a conference, this man did a message, and I don't know what he taught, because I just, during worship, right when they were transitioning to his message, I felt like God said, will you come away with me and spend time with me? I was like, of course. And he said, would you do it for a long time? Would you do it for like a protracted season of time? And I'm like, what does that mean? Would you say no to all these opportunities? And would you come away and get to know me and find me? And I'm like, of course, you're who I want. But I mean, like, really, you want me to say no to, is this like Isaac on the altar, or is this like, you really want to go away, And I felt like he said, come on, I define it as sabbatical. He didn't define it as that. Come on a journey with me. Kind of a wilderness time to come find me. Because if these are opportunities for me, they could always be recreated. And I was single, and I'd given God my 20s. Anyways, I wasn't dating at the time. And so I remember just following him, and it cost me. And it cost me a lot. I mean, it cost, like, I was on a team, traveling team, and there was a married man and a married woman and myself, and that made sense because there's three of us, but I was the one that held it together, because the person who invited us everywhere didn't really want either one of them without me. So it dismantled them. It dismantled the authoring contract, which also they were grafting in other pastors who were connected in their association because of my contract. They were bringing three more. And so when I said no, they all didn't get their contract. The TV show, when I said no, the ministry I was with was also being scouted out for a TV show, and they also didn't get their TV program. So it was, when I was saying no, I knew I was saying no, and it was going to close other doors, not just mine. So it wasn't like an easy no, because there's performance in it. But during that time, I went away and I had time to study. And Pastor Mike Bickle, who I love so much, he asked me to research the Bride of Christ for him at that time, and just said, could you go to libraries around the world and just study about who the Bride of Christ was throughout history, and that term Bride of Christ, any Catholic scholar, anybody who studied it. So I did, like, I think I had 2,000, 3,000 pages of like weird documents of people from mystics and saints and whatever about that. But I started to learn through that study. It was totally divine providential, because I could feel and see who God was in a way that I would have never, because most of our modern books about, in Australia and America, about revival or revivalists is linked to a church and a pastor and the number of people who got saved. Yeah. But the documents I was reading were linked to a person who had a connection, like John 17, to Jesus, that they felt one with God. They felt connected to God. And when I saw the difference between performance-based Christianity and authentic, like, I know you and you know me, I get to do this with you, but I don't have to do it for you. I get to do it. I get to be with you. I get to be your counterpart. And I love Mike Bickle because he's like a football coach and teaches on the Bride of Christ. Like, he's not the ooey gooey, person who, like Catherine Coleman dress, who comes in and teaches on it. It's like he's a football coach and teaches on intimacy with God. And so I went away for a whole year. Lisa, a whole year I went away and I didn't know if I was going to come back after the year. I didn't want to. And during that time, I got so grounded in encounter with his heart. And when I said it wasn't mystical, there was one mystical, real strong experience, but it wasn't mystical. It was just like a lifestyle of like reprogramming, kind of what I grew up in. And the faith I grew up in was very transactional, and it went from transactional to very connected. So was my favorite season because it transitioned me in my identity as a person. And we talk about identity all the time. It's one of the most popular subjects in the church, but a lot of people know how to talk about it, but they haven't actually changed. They can't even define it. And they can give you all the 5 points that Joyce Myers teaches or whoever teaches, but they haven't actually adopted it. And in that season, God killed everything in me that had identity and everything else. He did, but it wasn't like a bad death, because I was enjoying who I was becoming in the midst of that. So that's my favorite kind of, when you say what's a good God story, that it's a personal one, but I just feel like it was the time when I lost everything to actually learn who I was.
Yeah. And how was it when you first stepped back? Because I can imagine it would have taken a lot of courage to say no, and knowing that it impacted so many people. So you kind of had to trust God with them. But then when you actually stopped, was it uncomfortable?
Yeah, because I didn't know what to do. I am not the kind of person that wants to pray for 4 hours a day or 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day. So I'm like, what do I do? What does this actually mean? And I still ran my business, but I was still part-time. And so I was like, how do I find you? And so the research project really helped, because I'm an actionable person. I need to do stuff. Like I'm a performer, I'm a producer. So I wanted to fill time in a real way, but I learned how to fill my time with things that really mattered. So it wasn't that I just sat there and meditated for, like some people talk about these times where they look at the old saints and mystics of the early Catholic Church or Christian Church and they go, I want to be like that. And I'm like, do you really want to fast for 40 days straight 3 times and pray and listen to music, or go to these monasteries, which I went to a lot of monasteries at that time, to get manuscripts and copies of manuscripts, not full manuscripts, so I can give them back to the research project. And I'd go there and I'd do like the mazes, meditation mazes, which is very common in Catholic Church. And you're trying to separate yourself from everything that's human and mundane, and not even just the carnal, but just the humanity, and just trying to be spirit to spirit. And I was like doing these things. I'm like, these don't work for me most of the time. I understand, but I'm like, this does not work. Like, I just need Jesus, so I needed that. I needed the things that I didn't need to do things for him. I just needed the things to fill the time to help me to get to know him. And music was really key, which was good. Music was really, really helped. But I came out of it and I had a really strong experience where I didn't think I'd ever go in ministry again. I thought I was only going to go to the marketplace, and that I would see the most transformation through raising money and having impact with people who are influencers in the marketplace. So when he called me back first to ministry, I was devastated, but willing, because I wanted to do anything he wanted me to do. Yeah. But I was pretty devastated because I really felt like I didn't feel like ministry was the end time door of God, how Jesus was going to come through. Because when you look at the marketplace miracles, I think 39 of the miracles were done in the marketplace that Jesus did. So I was so ready to go to entertainment, to Hollywood, to the poor, and when he said, come to ministry, it took me a minute to reset and go. Yeah. Most people who are in the Christian conferences are extremely entertained, but don't change. Like, I want to go somewhere where people want to go and change and work and go, so it took me a minute to re-gear.
Yeah. And so how did ministry look like for you when you did go back to it after that year?
Super weird. I was really sick. I had got a parasite from Ecuador when I was going to some group down there, and it manifested a couple years later. So I was super sick. And January 1st, 2001. So it'd been over a year that I'd been on sabbatical type season, and people didn't know why I left. So they didn't know if I'd fallen from grace or if I'd committed some unpardonable act, and so they sat me down. They didn't know why. But people think the worst, So, but I had this friend she works in transformation ministries, and she randomly called me. She didn't talk to me in 9 months, and she randomly called me and goes, "We're doing a citywide leaders meeting to reconcile Black and white leaders in Kansas City, and it's completely segregated, and they don't like each other. Will you come and pray a prayer and maybe give a message?" And she goes, "But this is a very non-charismatic group, so you're gonna have to be really careful how you give a message." And that morning I had woken up, and it was one of those moments where you're like, turn on the TV, you need to watch something. It was like a news channel. Just that gut instinct came, and I turned it on, and Jesse Jackson is one of our reverends here that's very liberal, and some people don't even believe he's a Christian, and he was coming to our city, to Los Angeles. I was so sorry, to Kansas City. And so I woke up and I'm like, what are you showing me? Why are you waking me up? You called me back in ministry, and the first thing you're showing me is this guy who's coming back in, who I don't even know is a Christian. And God said that he is trying to move the hearts of the city, the leaders in the city, with a human agenda to bring reconciliation that I want to bring in a spiritual way. And I want you to prophesy about this and pray about this with some leaders. And then she called me the same day. And I'm like, is this what ministry is going to look like now? This is crazy. That's wild. But when I got there, the Black leaders were so mad that I talked to not negatively about him, but I just said, hey, he has a human agenda. God has a spiritual agenda. And God is going to, if he doesn't back down from his human agenda, God's going to expose a scandal that he's in. And it'll happen within 2 weeks. And so watch. And these Black leaders literally got up and walked out of the room. And then they asked me, the other leader said, why don't you go ahead and go for a minute? We want to talk amongst ourselves. So I got kicked out of my first ministry meeting that I came back for. And then 2 weeks later, they were in a smaller group with just 2 or 3 of the key white leaders and 5 of the key black leaders. And why they were in that meeting, Jesse Jackson, why they were having that meeting to recover from what had happened in this meeting, Jesse Jackson got exposed in an affair that he had had a baby from. And so they were like, wait a minute, God cares about civil rights and he cares about social justice in our city and racial reconciliation. Well, at first we were offended at this guy who spoke that, but now we know God cares because Jesse Jackson got exposed as I'm coming now. And what does God have to say? So they called me again and said, on the same day, can you come here right now and tell us what God has to say? And I literally didn't have anything. And that's how my whole ministry has gone ever since.
Just completely relying on him and just
going,
wow.
I shouldn't be. And if you talk about imposter syndrome, Christians are the ones who Forrest Gump their way through life because we don't belong anywhere God sends us. We belong to heaven, so we belong everywhere, but we go beyond our socioeconomic status, beyond our racial profile, beyond our, whether it's down or up, whether it's, as far as socioeconomics or beyond our education, like whether we're more highly educated, we go, towards people who aren't, or we're not educated at all. I remember sitting in front of when I still didn't have a, college education, I'm sitting in front of 2,700 PhD students in South Korea, one of the largest churches in South Korea, doing a 4-day seminar with them as part of their higher education system to get their PhDs to graduate for theology, and I'm teaching it. Like, wow. God puts you in places where you're like, you have no business being there unless God sends you there. And I think that's true of anybody, whether it's a career or a minister or whatever else.
Definitely. I can completely agree with that. And I've definitely experienced that. And he does just make a way, doesn't he? And all we have to do is just be ourselves and say yes.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. Shawn,
that's it.
What's I know that because I follow you and hear you speak online and whatnot, and often God, there's like a theme that you carry for a while that he places on your heart. Is there a message at the moment that he's placed on your heart?
I think my theme right now, we went extensively over, and I tried to help reinstall the heart for just the different prophetic gifts, like word of wisdom, word of knowledge, what is discernment, these kinds of things. And I'm realizing, as obviously we've had books that have gone around the world, and in those spaces are the top selling books in those spaces, even like Translating God, the one you mentioned earlier, where there's 100 and whatever thousand people read that book, which does a small number, but in the church world, there's never been a prophetic book that sold that many copies. So that was a big deal. And it's a love-based approach on hearing God's voice. Well, I think I've gone even further down the road, and a lot of conservative streams that are picking up on this, which is we need discernment like we've never needed because of things that are happening to us, society, societal changes that need to happen, and political change that need to happen, and all these issues that we're seeing the problems right and the left. And you can see what the enemy's doing. You can see what man's doing wrong. But very few people are discerning what God's saying about that, or what God wants to do about that. And there's these major problems on the table of humanity right now, and God has solutions. And I think so. What I've been carrying is the fact that we're about to come into a season where God is preparing people who are listening to this podcast, for sure, where it doesn't feel like preparation sometimes, but it is, because we're learning how to obey and we're learning how to know him. And so he can deploy us into places where there's the biggest problems in society, the biggest problems in politics, the biggest problems in education, the biggest problems in agriculture, the biggest problems in environment. And he can deploy us in his love and his grace, where people will be a before and after moment for people in that area. And they'll say, how did you have an option that wasn't even on our table for solutions? And I think that we're about to see a move of God doing impossible, but they'll feel very, very practical things for the world to show his love through people like us. And I think, so I've been focused on that because I feel like as I've been doing more and more journalistic commentary and social commentary, the problems are endless. Like when I come up with stuff to talk about on my show, I can come up with the problems all day long and it would last years and years and years. So always I look at how many people have viewed our content on like hours spent viewing or listening. And it's so many hours, I can't even quantify it. It's like too many hours of Shawn. And I think of that with God. Like there's so many stories out there that are so too many hours of humanity. And we need to have some hours with God that solve it all, that just start to really show what he can do. And I think that I think he's doing some things. I mean, I get to, I do Explain the Marketplace, which is marketplace leaders in every sector of the marketplace. And we get to hear how God's solving environmental issues all the time. We're going to hear about how God's, doing things with women all the time. Like this is women's time. And all of history, this is the best time to be a woman by far. And God's, like, I love some of the things that have happened. Like, I get to cover #MeToo and the Me Too movement, which is still relevant. It's still happening today. And I love that because my daughter's going into creative industries, which I think they're creative. I love that in my lifetime, God allowed an exposure of a satanic agenda to destroy women's lives. And it's affected men too, but predominantly women in the entertainment industry, because there was no boundaries put in place to protect the sanctity of women. And now there's all these boundaries. Now things still happen, but there's new boundaries. And we know for the most part, it shouldn't. If somebody asks you to take photos in their hotel room, like the standard answer is that's stupid. Like you're making a dumb decision. But before, if a producer asks you up to his room to do a reading, that might be okay. And that kind of thing. So I think that there's all these issues that we get to cover, and they're before and after moments in human history. And they're for us to see them the way discern, and the word discernment is really important. Discern what God's doing will give us hope. It won't just discern the negative, but we'll discern what God's doing. It's going to give us hope, and it'll place our feet in faith for a generation.
Yeah, that's so good. And so would you say, like, practically you'd go, okay, I'm noticing this issue in the world that is really grabbing my heart, rather than dwelling on that, going and saying, okay, God, well, what's your heart for this? Is it as simple as that, Shawn?
It is. I think I would take it one step further, because it is that.
Yes.
But a lot of people don't instinctively hear God in a clear way. So they hear God more through thoughts or feelings or instinct, or, so I would even go one step further and say, okay, I care about human trafficking. Who is doing it? What are the big wins of human trafficking now over the last couple of years? And do some Google research. Like, who's doing it? Who's doing it well? What are some of the stories of people who've changed whole systems, who've come up with policy with governments over human trafficking? Who's making the biggest impact? Okay, now I hate what the enemy is doing with this, but I have ammunition in my faith that God's going to destroy this. Like, William Wilberforce looked at the generation and said slavery shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
And if there's probably all kinds of other abolitionists, but they didn't know there was William Wilberforce until they found out about him. When they found out about him, they probably were like, okay, we can do this now. And I feel like a lot of people, they get really empowered by an issue, but in their heart, but they don't find out what God's already doing there. And so we're going to discern a lot of negative things, because we live in that generation where information's at the fingertips for, the internet. But what can we do about it? And asking the Father, what's in your heart, and then allowing him to show it to you through the power of stories of people who are Christians who are already there, and the power of, watching Balenciaga, like I'm talking about, trafficking and children at risk and stuff. Balenciaga, I mean, there's so many satanic companies out there. Some people just go down conspiracy road and just live in the conspiracy of it, and they don't have any impact, because then they stay away from the whole industry. Yeah. And fashion is a beautiful industry that there's a lot of great, amazing Christians involved with, and just good people involved with. But there's also this antichrist, anti-love, anti-children spirit, and it's being exposed. And that should, instead of Christians just spinning out and going, "Oh my gosh, Baal, we should be going, "Yes, God, you're doing it. You're in our time. You're judging something that has pedophilia in it. You're judging something that's wrong. Bring more exposure, but also now where this house held so much power, raise up people who will hold this power with your authority." And I know, like, one of the ladies I've had the opportunity to get to know and interview many times is Nancy Vu. And you can look her up at nancyvu.com. And she's been at all the high fashion weeks for years, and she's been developing these products, couture fashion line for children, funny enough. I just think her shows are so beautiful at Fashion Week Paris, at Fashion Week LA, at Fashion Week. And it's the exact contrast to what Balenciaga was, the dark, the demonic, the satanic. It's the exact contrast of like royalty, kingliness, queenship, and I'm like, raise that up. Yeah. Now that people are responding to this, raise up Nancy right now to be a household name, because Balenciaga is. Raise up Nancy, who's branding people their spiritual identity through her clothes. And she's getting more opportunities now. As this thing falls, she's getting more opportunities. So I think even recognizing that, like, learning how to see what God's doing is so important, because you'll stay with your tank will be overflowing all the time.
Yeah. And you live from that place of knowing what God can do and partnering with him and full of hope, rather than getting bogged down with the yuck. Yeah, I love that. Shawn, before we wrap up, would you mind just praying over those who are listening today. You can
Absolutely.
pray over any way God leads you.
Well, I do. I pray for specifically for inspiration, creativity, and how you know God, whether it's music or whether it's, of course, it's the Bible because that's part of it, but how the Bible comes to you versus just you reading. I pray that there'd be inspiration, creativity, and how God would speak messages to your heart, how God would interact with you, that you would see that God is amazing, that he's not limited to the two-way communication we're limited to, but he has so much investment in how he speaks to you through nature and through your career and through your family and through your children and through your spouse. I pray that God would speak, or even if you're single in your singleness, I pray God would speak to you and that you would know him in ways and that you would feel the intention of heaven to be creative towards you so that you can have the depth that you've already been longing for. Some of you have been so longing for that next level of like, oh God, I need more. I can't stay where I'm at. And that's called spiritual hunger. That's not negative. That's actually spiritual hunger. The enemy likes to make it feel like it's a bad desperation and he tries to tailgate on that. But God is bringing spiritual hunger in you. And blessed are the hungry, for they shall be filled. So I bless your hunger and I pray for the next level of creative alignment between how you do time with God and how you hear God and how you, I just imparting thing I have in hearing God's voice, that you would have more today as we end this podcast, that you would feel like you just got imparted to in Jesus' name.
Oh, thank you, Shawn. Now, for those who are really wanting to read some of your books or just follow more on what you do, what's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, just go to the Bolz app on any app store, go to bolzministries.com, and they'll find podcasts. Most of our stuff's free. So we have podcasts, our YouTube station. We have thousands of people interacting with us on YouTube. It's so much fun. But if they want to go to our Spiritual Growth Academy, we do have a subscription-based online. You can go anywhere in the world. We have a lot of Australians, so it's fun. And we do 4-week classes from some of the greatest speakers in the world, like Christine Kane will be with us this next year, and Real Talk Kim and Jones, and like so many fun people. Charity Berkler's teaching on angels right in January, which will be so fun. Catherine Crick's doing a deliverance event with us in January, and it's all online. So we wanted to do the spiritual heavy lifting of your spiritual growth, so that you can go somewhere and have a community where you're growing with. Maybe your local church only does prophetic classes once every 5 years. Well, we have them on there online, and everything's live for 4 weeks at a time, and then you get all the past classes and events that aren't live anymore. You get all those as well. So I hope people engage. It's a lot of fun. It's really cheap.
It is cheap, but what it holds is so rich. And I just want to say thank you for who you are. Thank you for saying yes to God and just carrying his heart and connecting others to him. It has impacted my life, and I know thousands upon thousands around the world, if not millions. So just bless you. Thank you, Shawn.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Love being here with you guys.
Thanks for joining me on Brave with Lisa. I hope that it has inspired or impacted you in a small or large way. Feel free to comment, to subscribe, and share with some friends. And please join us next week on another conversation we will have here on this channel on Brave with Lisa.